It was a Tuesday morning when my son told me I was losing my mind. He didn't say it like that, of course. Daniel never said anything directly. That was always his way, smooth words wrapped around sharp edges, polished enough that you almost missed the cut. He said it over breakfast, at the kitchen table I had built with my own hands 31 years ago, the same table where his mother used to sit with her coffee and her sketchbook every single morning before the rest of the world woke up. He said it gently, the way you'd speak to someone you were already certain couldn't fully understand you. "Dad, we're just worried. You left the stove on again last week. Sandra found your keys in the refrigerator." I looked at him across that table. My son, 52 years old. Salt and pepper hair he'd inherited from me. My wife, Eleanor's green eyes, looking back at me from a face that had slowly, over the last decade, become a stranger's face. "I know where my keys were," I said. "Dad, I put them there myself, Daniel. I was defrosting the refrigerator and my hands were full." He exchanged a look with his wife. Sandra was standing by the counter, both hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from, watching me the way you watch something you're waiting to break. She had red hair and small eyes, and a smile she deployed like a tool, efficient, purposeful, always in service of something. "The doctor said she started?" "I haven't seen a doctor," I said. Another look between them, longer this time. "We made you an appointment," Daniel said, "with a specialist, a geriatric psychiatrist. Just to baseline things, Dad, just so we all know where you are." I set down my coffee cup. I looked out the window at Eleanor's garden, which I had kept alive for 4 years since she passed. The roses she planted were still blooming. The stone path she designed still ran perfectly from the back door to the little bench where she used to sit and paint on summer evenings. "All right," I said. I said it quietly. I said it the way I used to say it in a different life, in a different room, when someone said something in front of me that told me everything I needed to know about what was coming next. "My name is Howard Calloway. I am 68 years old. I spent 22 years as a federal judge in the 7th Circuit before I retired to take care of my wife when she got sick. Before that, I spent 11 years as a federal prosecutor. Before that, I spent 7 years in the Army JAG Corps. For the better part of 4 decades, the law was not something I studied. It was something I lived inside of, the way a carpenter lives inside wood. I knew every grain of it, every place it bent, and every place it held. But Daniel didn't know that. Not really. He knew I had been a judge. He knew it the way children know facts about their parents as information, not as understanding. He had never sat across from me in a courtroom. He had never watched me work. He had grown up seeing a man who came home tired, who coached his Little League team on Saturdays, who grilled hamburgers in the backyard and helped him with his algebra homework. He had never seen the other version of me, the one they used to call something else entirely, in hallways I hadn't walked through in years. He had forgotten, if he ever truly knew, that I had not always been just his father. I went to the appointment. I answered every question. I completed every cognitive assessment they put in front of me. The specialist, a careful man named Dr. Okafor, who clearly felt uncomfortable with the entire situation, told me afterward, privately, when Daniel and Sandra had stepped out, that he saw no clinical signs of cognitive decline whatsoever. "Your scores are in the top 5th percentile for your age group, Mr. Calloway," he said, looking at his clipboard rather than at me. "I want you to know that." "But," I said. He hesitated. "The family has requested a formal written assessment for legal purposes." "I see," I said. And I did. I saw exactly. I drove home alone that afternoon. I took the long way, through the old neighborhood where Eleanor and I had lived when Daniel was born, past the hospital where he came into the world, past the school where he learned to read. I drove slowly, and I thought about my wife. Eleanor had been a painter, not a hobbyist. A real one gallery shows, collectors, a National Arts Foundation grant she won in 1994 that changed our lives for 2 years. She painted landscapes mostly, and portraits sometimes, and she had a way of putting light into a canvas that I could never fully explain and never stopped marveling at. When she died of ovarian cancer 4 years ago, she left behind 2 things that mattered: a house full of paintings, and a foundation she had spent the last 18 months of her life building, the Eleanor Callaway Arts Foundation, set up to provide scholarships to young artists in the state. She had funded it herself, from her savings and from the sale of several major works. She had asked me to serve as its trustee. I had taken that responsibility as seriously as I had taken every other responsibility in my life. 6 weeks after my conversation with Daniel at the kitchen table, I received a letter. It came from a law firm I didn't recognize, with an address in the city. It was formal, professionally written, and it informed me that my son Daniel Callaway and his wife Sandra Callaway had filed a petition with the probate court to have me declared legally incapacitated and to have a guardian appointed to manage my affairs and assets. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it along its original crease and set it on Eleanor's kitchen table. Then I picked up the phone and called a woman named Judith Hargrove. Judith had been the sharpest law clerk I'd ever had, back in my 7th Circuit days. She was 60 now, a senior partner at one of the most respected litigation firms in Chicago, with a reputation that made opposing counsel request bench conferences just to avoid looking at her directly across a courtroom. She had worked for me for 3 years. She had watched me write opinions that went to the Supreme Court. She had never once, in all that time, seen me uncertain about anything. She picked up on the second ring. "Howard," she said, "it's been a long time." "It has," I said. "I need your help, Judith." There was a pause. Then, "Tell me everything." I told her everything. I told her about the breakfast conversation, about the specialist appointment, about the letter from the law firm. I told her about Daniel's behavior over the last 2 years, the questions about my finances, the suggestions that I was spending too much on the foundation, the comments about the house being too large for one person. I told her about Sandra's habit of going through my mail when she visited and photographing documents with her phone when she thought I wasn't watching. I noticed everything. I had always noticed everything. Judith listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Have you looked at the foundation accounts recently?" she asked. I hadn't. Not in about 3 months. Daniel had offered to help with the administrative side of things after Eleanor died. And this was the mistake I would carry with me for a long time. I had let him. He had access to the foundation's bank accounts. Not signing authority, just view access, I had thought, just so he could help me track things. I hung up with Judith and opened my laptop. It took me 45 minutes to go through everything. When I finished, I sat very still for a long time. $87,000. Gone from the foundation accounts over 22 months. Small withdrawals, irregular intervals, amounts just below the automatic reporting thresholds. Whoever had done it knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the numbers. They knew the limits. They had been careful and patient and thorough. Eleanor had funded that account herself. She had sold 3 of her largest paintings canvases she'd spent months on, pieces she loved to build that foundation. She had done it from her hospital bed during the last months of her life, because she wanted something to outlast her. She had made me promise to protect it. I thought about my wife. I thought about her hands, which had been stained with paint for as long as I'd known her. I thought about the way she looked at me the last time I saw her fully conscious. That particular look she had, like she was memorizing my face. I did not cry. I had learned, a very long time ago, to save emotion for after the work was done. I called Judith back. "You need to get into the accounts," I said. "All of them. I'll send you everything tonight. And Judith, I need you to find out how they got access. Not just view access. Full access. Someone changed the permissions." "Howard," her voice was careful. "If what you're describing is what I think it is, this isn't just a guardianship case anymore." "I know what it is," I said. "I've prosecuted 40 cases that looked exactly like this. I know every step of what they did, and I know exactly how to respond to each one." Another pause. Then Judith said something she had never said to me in 3 years of working together. Something she had never needed to say when I was on the bench. "Are you okay?" I thought about that for a moment. "No," I said, "but I will be. Let's get to work." The guardianship hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in March, 11 weeks after I received the initial letter. The law firm representing Daniel and Sandra was a boutique outfit that specialized in elder law and estate disputes. Competent, experienced, the kind of firm that had handled dozens of these petitions and knew which arguments worked and which judges responded to which framings. They were good at what they did. I had watched better lawyers than them make worse cases stick, back when I was sitting on the other side of the bench. What they did not know, what Daniel had apparently never told them, or perhaps never thought relevant, was what I had been before I became his father. Judith had been building our case for 11 weeks. We had the financial forensics done by a firm that had testified in federal court 17 times. We had the bank records subpoenaed. We had the IT security consultant who traced exactly when and how the foundation's account permissions had been altered from a device registered to an address I recognized immediately. We had Dr. Okafor's assessment and his private notes. We had 41 months of documentation that I had quietly, carefully assembled, because I had known from the morning at the kitchen table that something was coming and that I needed to be ready for it. I had also done something else, something that took me longer and cost me more than anything else I had done in 11 weeks. I had gone into Eleanor's studio. I hadn't been in there since she died. I hadn't been able to. It still smelled like her linseed oil and turpentine and the particular soap she used, and the light came through the north-facing windows the way she always insisted it had to, clean and cool and perfect. Her last unfinished canvas was still on the easel where she had left it. A landscape. Our backyard in late autumn, the garden going to sleep for the winter. I stood in there for a long time. Then I started going through her records. Eleanor kept meticulous records of every painting she had ever sold. Buyer names, sale prices, dates, everything in a series of leather-bound journals she maintained with the same precision she brought to everything she loved. I went through 4 years of those journals, and I found something I had not been looking for and had not expected to find. 11 of her paintings had been sold without my knowledge. After her death, works that were part of the estate, works that under the terms of her will were to be either donated to the foundation or held in trust. They had been sold through a private dealer, quietly, for a combined total of $230,000. I found this out on a Wednesday evening in February. I sat in Eleanor's studio until the sun went down and the room got cold and dark around me, and I held one of her journals in my hands, and I thought about the fact that someone had sold my wife's paintings, her paintings, the things she made with her hands, that she put herself into, that she cared about more than money or comfort or convenience. Someone had sold them like they were inventory. I thought about what Eleanor would have said. She would have been furious in the quiet, absolute way. She had no shouting, no scenes, just that stillness that was somehow louder than anything else. She would have looked at me with those green eyes, the ones Daniel had inherited, and she would have said, "Howard, handle it." Yes, I thought. I will. The morning of the hearing, I wore the suit I had worn to my retirement ceremony. Navy blue, well-fitted, the kind of suit that was not trying to impress anyone, and therefore did. I drove myself. I parked in the courthouse garage, and I walked in through the main entrance, and I rode the elevator to the 3rd floor, and I walked down the hallway toward courtroom 7. I could see them through the glass panel in the door before I pushed it open. Daniel was seated at the petitioner's table with 2 attorneys. His posture, the careful posture of someone who has been coached. Sandra was beside him, in a gray suit, her red hair pulled back. She was turned slightly in her chair, talking to one of the lawyers. I pushed open the door and walked in. Daniel looked up. For a fraction of a second, something moved across his face. Not guilt, not yet. Something more like the expression of a person who had expected a different version of what they were seeing. He had expected, I think, his father. Tired, a little confused. Someone who needed to be taken care of. Sandra's eyes went to me and stayed there, flat and calculating. I walked to the respondent's table where Judith was already seated, her reading glasses on, a legal pad in front of her covered in precise handwriting. She looked up at me and nodded once. "You ready?" she said quietly. "I've been ready for 11 weeks, I said. I sat down. I set my briefcase beside my chair. I looked straight ahead. The judge assigned to the case was a woman named the Honorable Margaret Fenwick. She had been on the county bench for 9 years. I did not know her personally, but Judith had told me what to expect: careful, procedurally precise, skeptical of petitions that lacked substantial clinical evidence. Good. That was exactly what I wanted. She came in at 9 o'clock precisely and took the bench, and the bailiff called the room to order, and we began. Daniel's attorneys led with the standard framework for these cases, expressed concerns about my welfare, references to the specialist appointment, characterizations of my behavior over the past 2 years that I barely recognized as descriptions of myself. They presented it cleanly and professionally. They knew what they were doing. Judith let them finish. She was patient in the way I had always been patient, the patience of someone who has already won and is simply waiting for the formality to catch up. When it was our turn, she stood. "Your Honor," she said, "the petitioners have presented a concern about my client's mental capacity. We will address that concern directly and completely. But the court should be aware that before we are done today, the question of mental capacity will be the least interesting thing we discuss." One of Daniel's lawyers started to object. Judge Fenwick held up a hand. "Continue, Miss Hargrove," she said. Judith began with Dr. Okafor's complete assessment, not the summary version, the full report, all 23 pages, submitted into evidence. She walked through it methodically. Top 5th percentile cognitive scores. No clinical indicators of decline. No basis, in the doctor's professional opinion, for any finding of incapacity. Then she moved to the financial forensics. She laid it out the way I had taught her to lay things out back when she was my clerk and I was explaining to her how to build an argument that no one could dismantle slowly, clearly, one fact after another, each one connecting to the next. No jumps, no flourishes, just the architecture of what actually happened. $87,000 from the foundation accounts. The device from which the permissions were changed. The IP address. The dates and times that corresponded to occasions when Daniel had been at my house, alone, while I was at a medical appointment or running errands. The pattern of withdrawals. The amounts. The thresholds they'd carefully stayed beneath. Daniel's attorney was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is a completely improper—" "Sit down, counselor," Judge Fenwick said. Her voice had changed. It had the quality that very good judges' voices get when they are looking at something they did not expect and are deciding how to respond to it. He sat. Judith continued. She moved to the paintings, the 11 canvases. The private dealer, a man named Reston, who, when Judith's investigator had contacted him, had been cooperative in a way that suggested he was very eager to make clear that he had believed the seller had full legal authority. He had documentation. He had emails. He had a name. Judith set a single page on the evidence table. Sandra made a sound. A small sound, quickly swallowed. I did not look at her. "Your Honor," Judith said, "the petitioners filed this action, claiming that Howard Calloway is incapable of managing his own affairs. What the evidence shows is that while they were making that claim, they were systematically liquidating assets that belonged to him and to the charitable foundation established by his late wife. The court is looking not at a guardianship case. The court is looking at elder financial abuse, fraud, and the unauthorized sale of estate property." The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Fenwick looked at Daniel's table. Both attorneys were leaning toward each other, whispering rapidly. Daniel's face had gone the color of old chalk. Sandra was staring at the surface of the table in front of her with an expression I had seen before, not in my family, but in my courtroom, on people who had just understood that the ground they were standing on was not as solid as they had believed. "Miss Hargrove," Judge Fenwick said, "is your client seeking a counter-petition?" "We are," Judith said. "And Your Honor, my client would like to address the court directly." A pause. "That's unusual at this stage. My client has some experience with this room, Your Honor. I think the court will want to hear what he has to say." Judge Fenwick looked at me for the first time since the proceedings started. She studied me for a moment the way a judge does, professionally, quickly reading the person in front of them. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "you may speak." I stood. I buttoned my jacket. I walked to the center of the room, not to the podium, just to the open space in front of the bench, the place where I had watched hundreds of lawyers stand over the years, and where I now stood myself for the first time from the other side. "Your Honor," I said, "my name is Howard Calloway. I retired from the federal bench 6 years ago after 22 years in the Seventh Circuit. Before that, I served as a federal prosecutor for 11 years. I have participated in these proceedings quietly until now because I believe, and I have always believed, that the evidence should speak before the person does." I heard Daniel make a sound. I didn't look at him. My daughter-in-law filed or had filed on her behalf a petition claiming I am mentally incompetent. She filed this while her name appears on records authorizing the sale of 11 of my late wife's paintings. My wife spent the last months of her life building a foundation to support young artists in this state. My son had access to that foundation's accounts. $87,000 is missing. I paused. I looked at Judge Fenwick. I am not here today because I am confused or diminished or incapable. I am here today because my son and his wife believed that I was those things. They believed that because I had been quiet, I had been, for the past 2 years, a retired old man who tended his late wife's garden and didn't seem to be paying close attention. I was paying very close attention. I have been building this case since the morning my son told me I was losing my mind. I turned then. I looked at Daniel directly, for the first time since I had walked into the room. He was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was a child, something raw and undone, something that was not quite guilt and not quite grief, and was maybe both of them at once. "I loved your mother," I said. "Everything she left behind was sacred to me. Every painting, every dollar she put into that foundation, every brushstroke she put on every canvas for 40 years. She made those things. They were hers, and you sold them." I turned back to the judge. The petitioner's case should be dismissed. The counter-petition should proceed. And I would ask the court to refer the financial matters to the district attorney's office for review. I have prepared a complete summary package for that purpose. I reached into my jacket and produced a folded document. "May I approach, Your Honor?" Judge Fenwick stared at me for a long moment. Then, slowly, she said, "You may." I walked up and set the document on the bench. As I turned to walk back, she said, very quietly, not quite to me, almost to herself, "Howard Calloway, Seventh Circuit." "Yes, ma'am," I said. She looked down at the document. Then she looked up at Daniel's table with an expression that I recognized very well because I had worn it myself, many times, sitting where she was sitting now. "Counsel," she said to Daniel's attorneys, "I'm going to give you 15 minutes to confer with your clients. I want to be very clear about what I am looking at in front of me, and I want you to be very clear about it as well, because I intend to be in this room for as long as it takes to get to the bottom of every single item in this filing." She tapped the document I had given her. "We will recess briefly." "Do not go far." She stood. The bailiff called the room to order. She walked off the bench. In the sudden noise of movement and urgent whispered conversation from Daniel's table, Judith appeared beside me. "Howard," she said, very quietly, something like wonder in her voice. "Don't," I said. "You built that entire case yourself before you even called me." "I had 11 weeks and not much else to do," I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she laughed, a short, real laugh, the kind that escapes before you can stop it. "You haven't changed at all." "I'm older," I said. "That's the only thing that's changed." We didn't need the 15 minutes. Daniel's attorneys requested a brief extension, and then came back with an offer, complete withdrawal of the guardianship petition, full cooperation with the financial investigation, agreement to a repayment schedule for the foundation accounts. Sandra sat through this without speaking. She did not look at me once. Daniel looked at me once. Just before they left the room, he turned and looked at me. And I want to tell you that I saw in his face what I was hoping to see: real remorse, genuine understanding, the look of a man who grasped the full weight of what he had done. I want to tell you that, but I have spent too many years in courtrooms to lie about what I see on people's faces. What I saw was calculation. Even then, even at that moment, he was already figuring out what came next. Maybe that was the hardest part. Harder than the financial betrayal, harder than the paintings, harder even than the guardianship filing. The realization that there was no version of this where I got my son back. The person I would have needed him to be in order to get him back was not the person he had turned out to be, and I could not fix that. It had been a long time in the making, and it was not mine to fix. Eleanor would have grieved about this differently than I did. She had a capacity for sorrow that I always admired and never quite shared. She could feel loss completely, let it move through her, and still find her way back to something warm on the other side. I grieve by working, by finishing things, by making sure every edge is clean, and every account is settled, and every promise is kept. The foundation was restored within 60 days. The repayment was complete, with interest, which Judith had made sure was part of the agreement. The district attorney's office reviewed the file, and the matter of the paintings was referred for criminal prosecution. I did not seek that outcome, but I did not prevent it either. Eleanor's paintings were partially recovered. 6 of the 11 were located, and the foundation was able to reacquire them at cost from the buyers, who were cooperative when they understood the full picture. 4 of the paintings are now hanging in the foundation's first scholarship gallery, which opened in October, on what would have been Eleanor's 71st birthday. The 5th is in our living room, in the spot where it always should have been. It's the largest one she ever finished. A painting of the lake where we spent our honeymoon, the water and the light, and the particular quality of a summer evening that she somehow always managed to capture in a way that made you feel you were standing inside the moment, rather than looking at a picture of it. I stand in front of it sometimes, in the evenings. I have a grandson. His name is Marcus, and he is 9 years old, and he inherited Eleanor's green eyes and her habit of going quiet when something is interesting to him, and he had nothing to do with any of this. He is not a casualty of his parents' choices, and I have made sure of that. Daniel and Sandra agreed as part of the broader settlement to a family counseling arrangement that includes structured contact. I see Marcus every other Saturday. We go to the science museum, or the botanical garden, or sometimes just to a diner where he eats an enormous amount of pancakes and tells me about the books he's been reading. He asked me once, a few months after everything was settled, whether I was angry at his dad. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about what a 9-year-old needed to hear and what was true and whether those two things were compatible. "I'm disappointed," I said finally. "Do you know the difference between angry and disappointed?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thinks about things. "Angry goes away faster?" "Sometimes," I said. "But also when you're angry, you still think the other person might do better. Disappointment is when you've thought it through and you're not sure anymore." He nodded slowly. Then he ate another forkful of pancakes. "Is Grandma's paintings back?" he asked. "Some of them," I said. "The ones that mattered most." "Good," he said. And that was that. I think about Eleanor every day. That is not grief anymore. Not exactly grief was the first year. The second year, waking up and having the knowledge of her absence hit me fresh each morning like something physical. This is different. This is more like carrying something that has become familiar. A weight you've learned to move with rather than against. She knew me better than anyone. She knew the version of me that went to work in a suit and came home and barely talked about it. And she knew the version of me that sat in the garden on Sunday mornings and forgot to be anything in particular. She knew that the two versions were the same person. She never asked me to be one at the expense of the other. After I retired, she told me she was glad. She said she had always worried, watching me work not about the cases or the decisions, but about what it cost me to sit in judgment of people all those years. She said she thought I had earned the garden and the Sundays and the slow mornings. She was right that I had earned them. She was wrong that I was done with the other thing. There are people who think that age is a kind of diminishment, that what you were shrinks as the years go by, until what's left is just a smaller, slower version of the original. I have watched that happen to people. I have also watched it not happen. And I have spent enough time around both kinds of people to know that it is not entirely about luck or biology. It is also about whether you have remained curious and honest and unwilling to pretend that you don't see what you see. I see very clearly. I have always seen very clearly. My son made the mistake of thinking that because I was quiet, I was empty. That because I had stepped back from the world had stepped back from me. That because I tended a garden and went to bed at 10 and drove carefully and called my grandchild on his birthday and asked gentle questions about the Foundation's administrative needs, I had forgotten what I was. I had not forgotten. I am Howard Calloway. I am 68 years old. I spent 33 years in the law, and I know every inch of it. I loved my wife for 41 years, and I intend to keep every promise I made to her. I have a grandson with green eyes who eats too many pancakes and asks good questions. I wake up every morning and I drink my coffee at Eleanor's table, and I look out at her garden and I think about what the day requires. Some days it requires nothing more than weeding the roses and reading on the back porch until the light goes. Some days it requires more. I am not confused about which kind of day is which. I have never been confused about that. The Foundation gave out its first round of scholarships last spring. 12 young artists, 12 different states, each of them working in a different medium. We had a small ceremony. I sat in the back and watched them come up one by one to receive their awards, and I thought about Eleanor, about all those months in the hospital when she was moving money and making calls and writing letters and setting up accounts, building something that would outlast her because she had decided that was how she wanted to spend what time she had left. She was the best person I ever knew. That is not sentiment. That is a considered judgment from a man who has spent his career assessing people and their actions and their character. She was the best. I drove home afterward in the evening light, through streets I've known for 40 years, past the old neighborhood and the school and the hospital. I took the long way, like I always do now. There is no hurry. There is nowhere I need to be except where I am. I parked in my driveway and I sat for a moment before I went inside. The garden was just beginning to come back after the winter, the first green things pushing up through the beds Eleanor had planted, the roses beginning to bud at the ends of their bare canes. In a few weeks they would be blooming again. I would keep them alive. I had promised. I went inside and made myself a cup of coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table in the good evening light, and I was not angry, and I was not sad, and I was not anything in particular, except present, awake, still here, still watching, still paying very close attention to everything, as I always have been, as I always will be.